You've probably seen so many AI headlines lately that the numbers have honestly just stopped meaning anything, right? Every single week there's another $100 billion announced, another massive mega campus gets built, and we all just kind of scroll right past it. But we really shouldn't be moving on so fast. Just this year alone, big tech is on track to spend more than $700 billion building out AI infrastructure. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 2.5 cents of every single dollar the entire United States economy produces. It's staggering. NVIDIA's CEO literally called this the largest infrastructure build-out in human history. But when you look at this massive scale, there is a giant, glaring question hiding right in front of our eyes.
How on earth are they paying for all of this? Well, the answer actually starts with a pretty shocking figure: $1.65 trillion. One recent study found that just 5 major tech companies currently hold $1.65 trillion in hidden debt obligations. I'm talking about financial obligations that simply never appear on their public balance sheets. To give you an idea of how crazy that is, those exact same 5 companies report about $1.35 trillion of visible debt on their actual books. So the hidden pile of debt is actually way bigger than the visible one. Take Meta, for example. Their off-balance sheet debt is nearly triple their reported debt. And look, moving that much money completely out of sight, that isn't some simple magic trick. It requires a highly sophisticated, highly complex system.
Okay, let's dive into this central mystery. How exactly is big tech secretly funding this unprecedented build-out? Because, let's be real, a project of this magnitude doesn't just happen with the spare change lying around Silicon Valley. It requires an incredibly orchestrated, multi-tiered approach to vacuum up capital from literally every corner of the global financial system.
Section 1. Draining the vaults.
So initially, the plan was just to use their own cash. On the surface, these companies are the safest borrowers on Earth. According to PIMCO, the highest-rated names in this tech group carry a net debt of just 0.04 times their earnings. That is literally the lowest of any sector in the U.S. So the initial plan was incredibly simple. Let their massive internal cash machines pay for the AI build-out. But that cash machine started getting eaten alive. Historically, for most of the last decade, these companies spent roughly 40 to 50 cents of every cash dollar their businesses produced on capital expenditures, basically reinvesting back into their own growth. But today, PIMCO estimates that number has skyrocketed to 94 cents. Think about that. These tech giants are running their entire cash engine at maximum capacity just to feed the AI machine. The vault isn't funding the build-out anymore. The build-out is completely draining the vault.
So, what do you do when your cash vaults are draining? Well, you hit the bond markets. And boy, did they hit them at a pace we have never seen before. From 2020 to 2024, the 5 biggest hyperscalers issued an average of $28 billion a year in bonds. Pretty normal, right? In 2025, that jumped to over $100 billion. But then, we reached the first 5 months of 2026. In just those 5 months, they borrowed an astonishing $159 billion. That means, in less than half a year, they borrowed more money than they had in the entire previous 5 years combined. Let that sink in. The borrowing got so extreme that the deepest capital market on Earth, the U.S. credit market, literally could not absorb it all. The International Monetary Fund actually had to step in and flag it as a risk. Tobias Adrian, a senior official at the IMF, noted that it's quite worrisome from a financial stability perspective that major tech firms are starting to leverage up themselves so heavily. Because the U.S. market was completely saturated with tech debt, these companies had to look overseas. In just under 24 hours, Alphabet rapidly raised $32 billion across 4 different international currencies, even issuing a 100-year bond that was massively oversubscribed. Overnight, these American tech companies became the top bond issuers in foreign currencies where they previously had zero presence. No bonds at all.
Section 2. Return of shadow banking. So when the traditional avenues run dry, where does the money come from? Welcome to the shadow banking system. Now, this term was actually coined way back in 2007 by a PIMCO economist named Paul McKilley at a Federal Reserve symposium, literally right before the global financial crisis. He was terrified of this second banking system growing in the dark, a massive alphabet soup of non-bank investment conduits and vehicles. These institutions borrow and lend exactly like banks, but because they technically aren't banks, they operate without deposit insurance, without Federal Reserve safety nets, and completely outside traditional bank regulations. Fast forward to today, and the AI build-out is running on this exact same financing machinery.
Let's break down how this actually works using something called a special purpose vehicle, or an SPV. If that jargon sounds super confusing, let me give you a plain English analogy.
Imagine you want to buy a bunch of expensive stuff, right? But you really don't want the massive debt under your own name. So what do? You take out a credit card in your cousin's name. You're the one swiping the card, you're the one enjoying everything it buys, but when the bank asks about your legal debts, you can technically answer, hey, it's zero. That is an SPV in a nutshell. Back in 2007, this shadow system was built on piles of subprime mortgages. Today, it is entirely built on AI data centers.
Section 3. Inside Project Beignet. To really grasp how this operates in the real world, let's look at a live example down in rural Louisiana. It's a $27 billion deal relying entirely on an SPV named after a New Orleans fried pastry, Project Beignet. Let's walk through the mechanics of this massive deal step by step. First, a private investment firm called Blue Owl Capital creates the special purpose vehicle, known as Beignet Investor, and they put up 80% of the equity. Meta takes the remaining 20% and signs on as the only tenant. Second, this SPV turns around and issues $27.3 billion in bonds to massive money managers like BlackRock and PIMCO. Third, the SPV takes all that fresh cash and builds a multi-gigawatt data center called Hyperion. Finally, Meta moves in, sets up its servers, and pays rent, which in turn pays back the bondholders. But guys, here is the absolute genius part. Because Meta legally owns exactly 20%, they sit just a hair below the accounting rules' primary beneficiary threshold. Because they aren't the primary beneficiary on paper, that $27 billion in debt completely vanishes from Meta's balance sheet. Like magic.
Now, check out this tiny little footnote buried all the way on page 106 of Meta's public filings. It exposes the true nature of this entire deal. In corporate speak, this sentence basically means Meta is secretly guaranteeing the building's value to the bondholders. Meaning, if Meta ever decides to walk away and the data center's value drops, Meta has legally promised to write a check to cover the difference up to a $28 billion floor. They are effectively selling two completely different stories. To the Wall Street regulators, they say, hey, we don't own it, this isn't our debt. But to the bondholders providing the cash, they whisper, don't worry guys, we've got you covered for $28 billion if this whole thing goes south. And then there is the glaring mismatch in the timeline, which is honestly the cherry on top of this massive risk. The bonds issued to build this hyper-customized supercomputing site, they mature in the year 2049. That is a 24-year loan. But Meta's lease on the place, it doesn't even start until 2029, and it's structured in small 4-year chunks. So, if you step back, you have a massive 2.5-decade loan resting incredibly precariously on a short 4-year lease for a highly specific, custom-built building out in rural Louisiana. Now, if Beignet was just a one-off anomaly, maybe it wouldn't be a huge deal. But it wasn't. It immediately became the template for the entire industry. Enter Project Sopipilla. And yes, it's another pastry. Right now, BlackRock is actively marketing another $12 billion in bonds for Meta's newest AI data center in Texas, run by JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley. It uses the exact same 80-20 structure, the exact same legal loopholes, just a different location and a different dessert name.
Section 4. The ultimate financial parlay.
Let's zoom out for a second, because this is where it transitions from a clever accounting trick into a genuine systemic danger. We are seeing a very small club of lenders making the exact same structural bets across multiple tech giants. It's a trend that one lawyer, who spent years working on the 2008 crash litigation, described with two chilling words: déjà vu. Think about it. When 5 different borrowers use the exact same financing structure funded by the same handful of lenders, the risk stops being diversifiable. It is literally just the exact same bet written 5 times over. And the scale of this shadow debt is absolutely exploding. Estimates show that the off-book pile of debt across the 5 major tech companies has grown roughly 8 times over since just 2022. Moody's found nearly $1 trillion pledged for future AI leases, with over $660 billion completely invisible on main balance sheets. And Morgan Stanley's terrifying estimate? They believe the total off-balance sheet exposure across the tech industry has already swelled to roughly $1.8 trillion. So, the crucial point we have to understand is this. When you look at the fundamental economics, this massive infrastructure push has completely stopped looking like a rational business investment, and it has started looking a whole lot like history's largest casino bet. The tech industry is currently generating around $110 billion in AI revenue, but as we saw earlier, they are spending $700 billion. The math simply does not align with a safe, stable investment strategy.
For this massive gamble to pay off, and, not crash the entire system, 4 highly interconnected things must hit perfectly. It's like a financial parlay. First, AI revenue cannot just grow, it must drastically multiply. Second, the return on investment has to stop shrinking. Right now, the return on every new cloud dollar invested has already slid from 40% down to 20%, and it's projected to hit just 10%. Third, Morgan Stanley estimates there's a $1.5 trillion funding hole between current cash flows and planned build-outs that borrowers absolutely must fill. And finally, the U.S. power grid has to somehow magically absorb all of this completely unprecedented electricity demand.
All four of those legs are stacked incredibly precariously on top of each other, fueled by over $1 trillion in shadow debt just hiding in the footnotes of public filings. Every single leg has to hit perfectly for this to work out. Which leaves us with a final, incredibly provocative question to consider today. What happens to the global financial system if just one leg of this massive parlay fails? The systemic risk is hiding right there in plain sight, just waiting for us to pay attention. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep your eyes on the fine print. And hey, if you found this breakdown helpful, be sure to subscribe for weekly finance documentaries that explain money in simple English. Catch you next time.